Good morning. My name is Louise Adler. I'm a director of one of the directors of the International Insolvency Institute, who is presenting this morning the webinar, Just in Time to Just Be Patient. It's a webinar exploring the issues in the global supply chain problems. This is a presentation by the Triple I's US, Canada, and Caribbean Committee. The panelists that you will hear from this morning are all well experienced in the issues that they're going to be talking about. The panel will be moderated by DENIS FERLAND, who is a partner in the financial restructuring and insolvency finance and dispute resolution practice at the law firm of Davies, Ward, Phillips, and Vineberg in Montreal, Canada. His clients include large multinationals, banks, financial services, institutions, creditors, debtors, and court officers, including trustees, monitors, and receivers. He's a longtime instructor for the Chartered Insolvency and Restructuring Professional Qualification Program. And he's also vice president of the board of directors for the Insolvency Institute of Canada. Denis will be introducing his co-panelists. Then at the conclusion of approximately 1 hour of substantive presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions from the audience. You can start posing them as soon as you wish by putting them into the chat room, which is being monitored by our event producer, who will forward them to the panel. For those of you who have missed some portion of the presentation, you can, this presentation is being recorded and will be available later this week. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Denis, who will complete the introductions. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Louise. To all of you, I'd say for some good morning, good afternoon, or even good evening. Welcome to this webinar. I have the chance of being surrounded by two very knowledgeable person when it comes to supply chain issue, transportation. First, Brian NEMETH is a managing director at AlixPartners with more than 20 years of industry experience in the global shipping, freight forwarding, and third-party logistic industries, obviously with a record of success in helping clients strategically improve their performance. In addition to international transportation expertise, Brian has had the extensive strategic supply chain and logistic experience in a variety of industry sectors, including energy, retail, consumer foods, automotive, and industrials. He has an experience on both sides, the shipping and the shipper relationship. Prior to joining AlixPartners, Brian was with the United States, Hong Kong, and Vietnam within the AP Moller-Maersk group. Brian clearly has the knowledge required to address the audience today. The other panelist is BIBEAU. Landon is currently the Chief Marketing Officer at OEC Group in Toronto and is also the Vice President of Global Sale and Development for the Canadian Retail Shippers Association. The OEC Group is an international leader in the supply chain industry and helping businesses with white glove service in ocean, air, ground, and contract logistics. Landon started his career in China, and after working at Credit Suisse for 9 years, Landon moved to Hong Kong in 2006 and took the position as Vice President of the Canadian Retail Shipper Association. He then relocated to Toronto in 2018 to become the Chief Marketing Officer of the OEC Group after 12 years in Asia. So we have two knowledgeable panelists, and I'm pleased to welcome them. We'll first start by a presentation from LANDON and then from Brian as to the state of the supply chain and the problems that are related to it. And someone came up with the title "Just in Time to Just Be Patient," and we all thought that it was rather accurate. So LANDON, up to you.
Thank you very much, Denis. So I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes just talking a little bit about some of the things that we've encountered over the last 2 years since the pandemic hit, and the causes that it's had on the supply chain. I'm going to take a very broad and very quick overview, but how I'm going to start is just to show a little bit about the growth and demand that we've seen since in 2021, and this is a pretty telling chart. So this is a list of the top 30 ports and the volumes that they contracted in 2021. The largest 30 container ports in the world handled just over 450 million TEU, which is an increase of 6.8% over 2020. Just to put that into perspective, the long-term average for growth in containerized volume year over year is about 3.2%. We see we had a growth rate of over double what we're used to experiencing. In 2021, there were only 3 ports that posted a decline in volumes year over year. That number in 2020 was 15 ports. So you can see also that generally across the entire globe, there's been consistent growth of containerized volume transiting through ports. 9 of the ports logged double-digit throughput, which is obviously dramatic increases. Some of those were, let's say, smaller or lower on the top 30, which moved up, so their volumes were coming from lower levels. But some of them, and very tellingly, for example, Los Angeles, which is the 9th largest port in the world, had a 15.8% growth in container throughput. And Newark port system, which is the 18th largest port in the world, had a 18.5% growth year over year. Another interesting fact about this graphic is that Chinese ports now handle nearly 47% of the throughput of the top 30 ports in the world.
LANDON, if I may, what is throughput?
So that's a good question, Denis. Throughput is the number of containers that are handled in a port through a year. So the ports will handle cargo that's originated in that area. So if we took Shanghai for an example, cargo that's manufactured and containerized around the port of Shanghai, but it will also handle the volumes that come from smaller ports that will transship in Shanghai or Singapore, for example. So they will count that container as going through their port system as well.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. So with that growth in demand, most transportation participants were caught off guard because, as we saw in early 2020 at the onset of the pandemic, people were not sure what was going to happen. And so a lot of orders were canceled, whether it be for manufacturers or retailers canceling orders that they had for new product. But similarly, carriers weren't sure about what the demand picture was going to look like and how broad the lockdowns and shutdowns were going to be for the ocean carriers. And so they canceled new orders. So we've had a situation where demand has grown at more than two times the normal average globally. And at the same time, we've had a lack of new supply of containerized vessels coming into the market. So at the end of 2020, there was a huge push for new orders and new vessels coming into for new builds, I should say. The issue with that is that there's a lag in between how long it takes to build a ship and have it put into production. So you can see from this chart, in 2022, there's only about 1.1 million TEUs being added into the market. And that on a fleet of 25 million TEU basically represents zero growth, because there are repairs and there are scrappings that have to happen every year. So this demonstrates that even in 2022, we will not have the supply growth that we need to be able to handle the demand that we've seen since the start of the pandemic. Where it starts to alleviate a little bit is in 2023 and 2024. Both of those are expected to deliver, they're supposed to deliver around 2.4 million TEUs of new capacity, which is something that's basically double what we're going to see in 2022. And we can see already for 2025, there are orders that are coming in, and the expectation is that these new orders will continue to grow. One thing I would caution is that although we are adding new buildings and new capacity into the market, that this is probably not going to completely alleviate a lot of the problems that we've seen. Next slide, please.
And Landon, before we move to the next slide, or as we're moving on to the next slide, what does TEU stand for?
That is the measure of units that we use in the transportation industry. So it stands for 20-foot equivalent unit, which is the smallest denominated size for a container that will go on a boat. So,
okay.
So with the increase in demand and the lack of supply that's been handed or input into the market, shippers have seen huge levels of disruption and great delays in the time in which it takes to get product that typically they're manufacturing overseas and importing into their home market. This is something that Brian is going to talk about a little bit later, but I thought it was an interesting graphic. In 2019, this OTI, which is the Ocean Timeliness Indicator, which is something that a company called Flexport puts out. In 2019, somewhere in the second or third quarter, we hit a record low in terms of time it takes from something to be prepared and ready to be shipped at a factory to delivered at an importer's distribution center and essentially ready to be distributed to stores. That number from Asia to North America was 40 days. Since that time, we've seen a steady and dramatic increase to where we hit record levels in December of 2021 and January of 2022 of greater than 110 days for that same product to make that same voyage. So the delays that the shippers have been facing have been dramatic. Next slide, please. As you could probably expect, the carriers' decision to do there was no conscious decision for carriers to double or more than double the transit time. What happened was the reliability of the entire infrastructure dropped dramatically. And you can see here, I've got two interesting graphics that I've shown recently. The one on the left is the global schedule reliability year over year. You can see the long-term average is somewhere around 75% globally. In 2021, it was less than 40%, 36, 37%. So global schedule reliability fell to the lowest level ever that's ever been recorded. Of the global schedule reliability, the worst offenders was what we call the TPEB, which is Trans-Pacific Eastbound. That was the worst performer. The reliability in Q4 of 2021 actually fell to a level of 8%. So that basically is telling us that 92% of vessels that were coming into to the U.S. West Coast and the Canadian West Coast were delayed in some form or fashion. We have no carrier. We have no carrier no carrier that had a global reliability of greater than 50%. So you can expect that 1 out of every 2 containers was going to be delayed. And we saw the port congestion grow to record levels in September of 2021, where we had over 120 vessels sitting outside of the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, waiting to berth and not being able to be utilized in the fashion in which they were intended. Next slide, please. So all of that for when we've seen the industry with the great disruption that was caused, we've seen the industry gaining record profits and being able to force shippers to pay record high prices. So in 2021, every major ocean carrier had a record year, and most have predicted equal, if not better, performance in 2022. Carriers are going to continue to reinvest their profits, but even with the reinvestment of their profits into new technologies and to new vessels, it's still only 25% of the industry profits that are expected to be that will be reinvested into additional capacity. Some of the carriers saw EBIT increases by over 800% in 2021. At the same time, as I just showed, we have reliability and service levels at all-time lows. There's a large frustration amongst shippers and the shippers community. And we expect that the supply chain, which is already at historic highs, to continue with further disruption, and that we're going to have some external factors that are going to continue the disruption that we have here in 2022. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Landon. Brian, up to you now.
Thanks, Landon. Thanks, Denny. Great. If you can, perfect. Thanks. So disruption, I think, Landon, you said it a few times in your presentation. So I think it's a great way to start and talk about the major theme for the shippers themselves. You know, AlixPartners runs this disruption index, and what makes it relevant here is 3,000 executives across across multiple industries and multiple geographies. We're all surveyed about, their largest concerns. And what's interesting here is, well, we have one eye-catching stat here that 72% of these CEOs are worried about their jobs. But the more relevant for the conversation is the greatest area of concern is supply chain. And so 70% of these CEOs around the world are concerned about the impacts of the supply chains, and 77% are concerned that the right actions haven't even been taken to appropriately address the concerns that exist. And so again, this is our second year of the survey here, but to have supply chain front and center is very eye-catching here. And secondly, the other two areas, workforce and digital, whether or not specific to supply chain, they're very relevant to the challenges that are being faced today. So if we talk about disruption and what all this means to the supply chain, if you could go to the next slide. When we've been talking to all of our clients, basically shippers again across industries, the most common theme that kind of brings us all together is really built around inflation. And you can see here inflation's at record levels. If you look back, even at November, these 12-month trend of increases is the longest streak since the year 2000. And so when we're talking about inflation and we're talking about it in the context of supply chain, we're really looking at 3 parts. So the inputs or raw material, the transportation aspect, and then labor. And so if we go to the next slide, what you'll see here is the inputs that, or the raw materials that are, flowing through in the supply chain. And here we've seen, extreme increases. This is an 8-year period, each of those little graphs, but we're seeing extreme increases since the start of COVID. And basically you're seeing metals, right? Aluminum and steel, oil, lumber, cotton, all the critical inputs in raw materials into a lot of the products that we all consume, have gone up at a considerable rate. And so this is a very important element to keep up with. People or shippers and importers look for other alternative sources to find these commodities. And again, a large driver in the cost, which we'll talk about as we get further through the presentation.
And Brian,
Next,
clear,
yes.
the number in red above each graph is the percentage of increase?
That is correct. It's basically since the start of COVID, how much things have increased, those particular commodities.
Thank you.
So the next area is around transportation costs. And so transportation costs have gone up to record levels across all forms and modes of transportation. So that includes international, where we talk, typically about ocean and air, and then domestic over the road or over the land transport, rail and trucking. What you see here, though, is a snapshot of container shipping. And it shows 3 lines. There's the overall global index about roughly showing the cost to ship worldwide from Shanghai. Then there's 2 other lines. One line is Shanghai to Europe, and the other is Shanghai to the US West Coast. Those are the 2 largest shipping lanes. And you can see here how drastically the cost has gone up and the steady rate it's basically gone up since COVID began, right? And so all modes have gone up, but nothing has gone up at the same rate in which the ocean freight market has gone up here. The other area to highlight on this next slide, which also impacts the disruption, and I think, Landon, you did a great job of explaining the delays and the reliability. These are 2 more charts that really, express the same thing. What I want to highlight here from the shipper perspective is, what does this all mean? And when you think about it, it changes ordering patterns, and it also changes inventory strategies. So when you see this disruption, you're getting, increased variabilities. And we talk about inventory first. A lot of safety stock calculations and inventory calculations are based off of lead time and variability. And when you add this to the equation, you kind of are getting to this trend, and it's becoming, the succinct and hot way to say right now is, instead of just in time, we're moving to this just in case inventory model. And so what you're seeing is, again, this variability is driving shippers and importers to rethink their strategy and bringing in a lot more inventory than they have historically done it. And then because of these delays, they're also changing the order patterns. So if you might have ordered 90 days in advance historically, now you're potentially ordering 120, 150, or 180 days in advance. And so this distorts the what had been the historical normal shipping and transportation kind of routes and frequency and volume and the seasonality of all of it. The next area is labor. So if we look at this next chart, what we see is labor, job openings in general, right? In the US specifically, and in North America, unemployment is very low. There's a ton of job openings. And what this chart specifically is showing is in the transportation, warehousing, and utilities jobs. And you can see this huge increase, 90% from the start of COVID to now, in job openings within the transportation space. And so this is also having an extreme impact on supply chain performance, right? If you can't get warehouse workers, you can't unload your containers, you can't pick the individual products that need to go to the stores or go to your homes. And so what we're seeing with these job openings is lower productivity. And in addition, what we're also seeing is obviously the supply demand equation get thrown a little bit upside down here, which leads us to the next slide, which is basically built around labor cost. And so if you go to the next one, here you can see, this is just general. In transportation, it's been even stronger, the increase or the rate of increase. But what you're seeing is steady increases in wages, and you're seeing double-digit increases, historical from the spring of 21. And so what's happening, right, is you can't find good labor and you're overpaying for that labor, and basically the cost of the supply chain and the reliability of the supply chain is being impacted by that. So if we recap these elements, right, you have increasing raw materials, increasing transportation costs, increasing labor costs, and all this in the service levels around all those three things is kind of at some of the worst levels it's been. And so what you get is this inflationary market around the supply chain. And a lot of these costs are going to get passed on to us as consumers in the long run. And I think what we have here is in the final slide, or the final slide here. This is a good synopsis of what's really happening. We took a pair of shoes, basically, that travel from a factory in China and basically get delivered here in the United States. And we basically took a snapshot of what it looked like pre-pandemic and what the current situation is. And we looked at two things. We looked at transit time and we looked at the cost side. And we put it into these 5 buckets here. And so origin port processing, right? Coming from the factory, these shoes getting delivered to a port. We're seeing delays that are occurring. We're seeing delays at factories. The most recent one to hit the news is, the Shanghai lockdown for COVID. That means factories, that means warehouses are unable to operate and product is unable to be delivered to the port. The second area is the actual ocean transit itself. And so the ocean transit itself has, at one point it sped up and now it's slowed down to basically get the optimal cost or consumption of fuel, because unfortunately what's happening is it's arriving at the ports and it's being forced to kind of queue up and wait online to berth and get unloaded. And then drayage, which is the terminology for the trucking of the container itself. A truck comes with a chassis to the port and moves the container itself. There's been lack of equipment and again, ability to get drivers have made it very challenging, and you've seen a large increase in the time it takes to get the containers out of the port. This also involves the ability of the rail companies to move the freight off the port itself, and then the ports themselves just being overwhelmed. And then the last piece we have here is the destination process and shipping. And so this is what's happening within the 4 walls of the warehouse. And like I talked about in the previous round, labor, if you can't get warehouse workers, you can't process your shipments when you come in. You can't pick and pack that pair of shoes that you want to get delivered to your home in time. And so what we're seeing is these delays straight through from beginning to end are almost doubling the transit time it took before the pandemic to where we are at the moment. And in addition, the cost. And so, like I said, costs have gone up in all areas. Where you see it the most extreme is ocean, but it's gone up across the spectrum. And based off of Q1 of 2022, we're estimating basically a 64% increase in the logistics and transport costs from that pair of shoe pre-pandemic. So again, I think this was a very good synopsis of that whole inflationary story. The only thing we didn't talk about here is the raw materials in the shoe, but you see the impact of the labor, you see the impact of the transportation costs, and I'm trying to distill this to the consumer, to the layman and in the world, right? Is your pair of shoes are going to take longer to get here, and they're going to cost more than they did in pre-pandemic, and we can all expect it to hit our wallets in the future. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Denny.
Well, thanks to you both. It was 2 great presentations. But I'd like to bring up a few topics that we can talk about in the coming minutes. And I'll start with, I guess, the question, which is, when did the supply chain begin to be problematic and what caused this? Actually, how meaningful was the pandemic on the disruption of the supply chain? Landon.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm sure Brian and I could talk about this for the next few hours, but the pandemic was a major impediment to the fluidity of the supply chain. And not many people remember, but at the start of the pandemic, obviously most people were focused on Wuhan and how the disease was developing there. But China and its zero COVID policy basically shut down their country. That prevented any production to happen. Typically, the pandemic started right around the Chinese New Year in 2020, and that's typically a very slow time for production and manufacturing in Asia because of the Lunar New Year and the factory workers who are returning to their home. What we saw was an extended Chinese New Year period, so where production was very slow and there was very little demand for containerized shipping, followed by the disease coming to Canada and the lockdown, Canada and the US, and the lockdowns we saw in North America, which similarly put a panic into the buyers of these products, and orders were canceled, and therefore demand hit all-time lows in terms of the need for shipping trans-Pacific or even across transatlantic. So what carriers did in response to that was they parked their vessels. They took all of the capacity that was not needed out of the market, and which was not a small decision, but they parked their vessels over in Asia. Fast forward a few months, everything started to open again. There was huge demand because people were stuck at home and they were no longer able to spend their discretionary income on travel or restaurants or anything like that. And so they decided that they were going to improve their houses, do some renovations, buy new furniture, buy new sports athletic wear, things that we've seen boom during the stages of lockdown. And the supply chain was not in a position to absorb that great demand boom. So the reason where we are, we've still been recovering from that since 2020. We have not been able to catch up because the demand boom has been consistent throughout the last 2 years. So it's had a major impact. The supply chain was working smoothly before the pandemic, but now with the great increase in the rate of demand that we've had, there wasn't enough capacity elasticity to manage it all.
But just coming back to this very last issue, would you say that pre-pandemic, the supply chain was well oiled and it was working properly, and it's really the pandemic that caused the disruption?
I think the supply chain was optimized for the demands that we had pre-pandemic. And I think that it was working smoothly. Of course, there are always some disruptions and there are always factors that come into play. But I think in general, if you thought to have a low-cost option to receive product that was created in a low-cost country in your DC in less than 40 days, I think most people would say that that's an optimal situation.
And I think to add to that, Denny, I think what we've been doing since I started my career, you said 20 years experience. Since I've started my career, it was always about optimizing the supply chain and taking fat out of the supply chain, right? How do we make it as efficient as possible? And I think this is one of the consequences of basically at least 20 years of focus on how do we make it as lean as possible, just in time, cutting costs and getting people their products as cheap as possible and as efficient as possible. And I think what you ended up with is this finely tuned machine, and you pulled that one gear, that one cog out of the wheel, and it's just fallen apart, and now it's playing this catch up. I think, Landon, you did a great job of describing all the things that have happened and how this has all played out. But I think the underlying issue or the overarching issue was the like literally the last 20 years, it's how do we get it more efficient? How do we get the supply chain as efficient as possible and as cheap as possible? And we got it so tight that we didn't leave the buffer for something like this that no one really could have foreseen.
And of course, the pandemic had a huge impact, but would you say that it was doomed to failure as a result of the fact that we're trying to optimize everything, and that actually any given disruption would have created what we see now? Or if it took something as big and as humongous or as important as the pandemic?
So I would say, I wouldn't say, I would say in terms of numbers, it's very dramatic, the growth that we've seen, and I covered it in my presentation. The amount of growth we saw in containerization. It's even more dramatic when you look at it at a micro level. So the biggest trade lane, like Brian mentioned, is the Trans-Pacific Eastbound, which is basically from Asia to the U.S. West Coast, and that growth rate is typically in line with the long-term average of around 3%. We saw numbers in 2021 and 2022, if you exclude the period of the shutdown, that was over 12%. So our infrastructure was not prepared for that kind of increase. And I don't think that anybody expected that such a demand would grow. I mean, we've seen some shocks to the system in the past years. I think the tariffs that were intended to go in 2018 created a shock as well, where people were trying to have cargo arrive prior to the tariffs being implemented. But even then, they pale in comparison to what we saw from the basically discretionary income that consumers had, in addition to what they would normally have if we were in a normal situation.
Let's move on from the pandemic per se. Anyone who reads the newspaper today or watch the news on TV or anywhere else knows that there's a meaningful conflict in Ukraine. And I was wondering, what's the impact of that conflict on the supply chain, whether worldwide, in Europe, in North America, for transportation, for the routes that carriers could use either on water or in the air? What's the impact, if any? I would assume there's one.
Yeah, most definitely there is. The impact, I mean, the implications are global. Obviously, we've seen commodity prices go up. We've seen oil prices go up. So that obviously has a large factor in terms of the cost for the transportation industry. But also, Russia being such a large landmass is also a very important producer of commodities. It's also a very important transit hub. So something that's come to light very recently is the demand for rail from China to Europe has dropped to nearly zero. And this was a new solution that's probably been developed over the last 10 years that has reduced the transit time of a container from China to Europe, which over the sea would take somewhere about 40 to 50 days, to about 10 to 15 days. And so that artery has basically been shut off. So there's on the ocean freight, on the ground logistics, in terms of cost, especially for fuel and commodities, has gone up dramatically. And of course, the closing of the airspace in the surrounding area. So the entire transportation industry has been greatly hit by the conflict that's going on there.
And this is an immediate impact, but do you foresee, and hopefully this conflict will come to an end soon, but do you see a longer term impact on flowing from that conflict?
I think it really depends. I think it really depends on how the conflict is resolved. As I said, it is an important transportation artery, whether it be by rail or if it is by air. If that space is not deemed to be secure, and if it's not able for people to utilize it, it will cause long-standing impacts, and it will create further supply shortages on the ocean side and on the air side.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that. One of my colleagues, Mark Wakefield, who's the lead of our automotive practice, was talking the other day about critical auto parts and the shutdown of plants. So that's a real life example of something that's currently being affected by what's going on over there.
So I guess the shortage of cars will not only be caused by the chips, but by the parts as well.
Exactly.
And if I understand correctly, there are plants that have been shut down in Germany as a result of the lack of parts coming from Ukraine.
Yes, yeah, most definitely. Most European manufacturers have some sort of production in either Ukraine or Russia, and most of that production has been halted.
Now, clearly that's a conflict, but there are others. There's various local conflicts or local issues, whether it's the boat that was stuck in the Suez Channel, whether it's the blockage of the Ambassador Bridge. How do we deal, or the various protests? I mean, the train tracks in Canada were blocked just before the pandemic. How does that impact the supply chain and the transportation worldwide?
I think when I think about those examples, Denny, like those types of things, you couldn't necessarily predict them, but they've happened. There's always been small kind of disruptions and localized disruptions. If you think about, you know, union negotiations in the U.S. over time, you know, they'll disrupt for a period of time, and there could be flooding in, I think actually wasn't there flooding in Northwest Canada earlier, right? Like there's things that occur that have historically happened, and it disrupts the supply chain for a period of time. I think these are all amplified by the, you know, if COVID was the foundation of the disruption, you know, the Ever Given getting grounded and the Ambassador Bridge, you know, being basically shut down, all these disruptions just are just amplified by the, you know, the overwhelming kind of COVID disruption. And I think we'll always see these types of things occur over time. Even when we get back to normal, there'll be localized disruptions that have an impact, and I think shippers do their best to adapt when those things pop up.
I guess it's the old saying, when it rains, it pours.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think Brian touched on it very acutely. I think these problems are going to persist. We're going to have them. They will be unpredictable, and we'll have to manage when they do happen. What I think has changed during the pandemic is that shippers have realized that they need to be more nimble, and so ways around these blockages are being thought of in the boardrooms of these major companies. And I think that's a general positive, because traditionally what we would do is we would maybe look for some alternatives, but we wouldn't disrupt the entire flow of the supply chain. Whereas now I see a lot of creative solutions coming out. If you take the Ambassador Bridge, there were planes being flown from Windsor to Detroit, which is only about a 45-mile distance, right? Because the bridge was blocked, and auto parts were not able to go over land, which they would normally do. We've seen a lot of really interesting solutions being proposed by shippers or by transportation companies in order to prevent further delays as much as possible.
So does that mean that we should expect the Suez Channel to be widened?
It's something that they're trying to do, right? They're constantly changing that. The Panama Canal was widened not too long ago. We're trying, like Brian said earlier, we've been trying to optimize the supply chain for the correct scope and scale of what needs to be moved over time.
So all of that, what's the impact on how the businesses are run? How much of a preoccupation is it for the businesses in general? Landon, what would you say on this?
I think Brian's first slide is pretty telling, right? If 70% of CEOs in America have this on the forefront of their mind, and they see this as being a huge impetus to their success. I think businesses are being forced to be run with the supply chain in focus. There are a lot of creative ideas, like I just mentioned, being thought of. There's also a lot of budgetary increases that are being put in place. So as we saw, the cost of these things, the cost of transportation has grown dramatically. So the CEOs and executives are very focused on the supply chain, and it's something that probably 2 years ago, or as short as just over 2 years ago, no one would even consider they had management in place in order to take care of international and domestic transportation.
And Brian, given your expertise and your acquaintance with the businesses, what would you say on that?
I know, I agree. It's funny. I tell my friends and colleagues are reaching out because of my experience. The first 18 years, no one really understood what I did or exactly what I was focused on. And all of a sudden, everyone's calling and saying, "What's going on? And when is it going to get fixed?" And it manifests itself like in work in the context of a lot of times I worked with like a COO that would be kind of my senior sponsor on a project. And now I find myself presenting to the CEO and the CFO, and I'm explaining what the ocean market is, and I'm explaining what's happening in the trucking market. And so when you talk about disruption, these are things that weren't on the radars of a lot, it depends on the industry, but for a lot of industries, transportation was just something that happened. And, if everything went well, it was kind of like, no one noticed, but the second something went wrong, everyone noticed. So what you're seeing is a lot more attention on the executive level. It's impacting the bottom line. It's impacting investors and shareholders, and it's just become all encompassing. And what we're doing with clients, there's the short-term aspects, the tactical solutions. And I think, Landon, you've touched on this. People they're a lot more creative than they used to be, right? I used to only have provider X and I always shipped my product the same way. And now you have, tell me all the different freight forwarders or steamship lines I could possibly talk to who might be interested in my business. Tell me more about this, purchase order consolidation that I could do in China, where I could take from 3 different vendors and put them into one container that's really important to me that I could get over. Tell me about transloading, which is when you take your containers when they arrive in North America and you put them in the 53-foot trailers in order to have less movement so you can, get access to supply. So there's a lot of tactical elements going on. And at the same time, there's a lot of strategic conversations that are happening. I think this has exposed a lot of companies' lack of visibility on international supply chain. A lot of our customers didn't even know where their containers were, or they're looking on an Excel sheet and they have this person who's going on to all the different websites trying to figure out where containers are to give a status update. And then we have other customers that have built really sophisticated, digital solutions where, it's in their ERP and everyone in their business can see, where the freight is, when's it supposed to arrive, and what actions can they take, if any. And so a lot of shippers are thinking, one, how do I get visibility and what should I be doing to avoid this in the future? I think flexibility is the word. And the other strategic piece is it's kind of reinvigorated the nearshoring and reshoring conversation. And so this has come in cycles throughout my career. And I think this is the most serious I've seen it taken. If you're 100% in any country, whether or one region, if you're 100% of sourcing in China or Southeast Asia or in India or wherever, we're seeing a lot of shippers reevaluating that strategy and just saying, I'm willing to pay more. I'm willing to pay a premium, not for all of it, but I want to hedge my risk. And I want 10% or 20% or 30% of my sourcing nearby, whether that's in North America or whether it's in America or Canada or moving it to Mexico. But these are real conversations that are happening, and these are things that fundamentally actually change the supply chain. So Landon, we talked about demand. If enough people just move 10%, that's 10% of demand that comes out of the international supply chain and frees up the space. So these are the types of conversations and the type of disruption it's led into the boardrooms and the management and the shipper conversations. These are conversations that were superficially spoken about, and now they're becoming a lot more serious and they're becoming real in many cases.
So would it be fair to say, because you used a word before, which was the optimization, and we went from an era where optimization was basically the target to a new era where alternatives need to exist, and you need to be able to have a better visibility on what might occur given the disruption, the pandemic, and so on.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of a lot of people trying to optimize. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to optimize a situation that's very disrupted, and in some cases even been called broken before, right? And we actually see something I wanted to mention to Brian's point is government intervention. And to your original question, if we see the government coming into trying to fix the supply chain, they must have a lot of pressure from the business participants, because that's what's happening. We've seen a lot of discussion, especially in the United States, about trying to fix the supply chain. But we've had examples of it globally, and in Canada, the government has come in and has bought a plot of land in Vancouver to be able to facilitate the return of empty containers, which has never been a problem historically. We've seen Joe Biden talk to the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach and force them to run 24-hour gates. Now, not all of these things are going to be very successful, and some of them are going to be fruitless. But the fact that they're focused on this where they haven't been previously, I think is a telling factor of where we are today.
And that leads well into my next question, which is, what's the impact on pricing, on transportation, on the goods, and ultimately, does it create inflation? I know, Brian, you touched upon that in your earlier presentation. Can you expand on this?
Yeah, no, there's obvious inflation at the moment, and I think unfortunately that inflation is on the transportation side is probably here to stay for the rest of 2022. But I think there's a big timing issue, right? There's contracts that are made, and the contract timing might not align with when the costs themselves are actually incurred. And so what I think we'll see is a little delayed impact of increased costs to us as consumers. So, you know, what you might have contracted with somebody as a supplier, you know, at $5 a widget, and now you know your cost has gone up to $5, but you can't trigger a price increase until X amount of time in the contract of the new contract period, and then your widget price is going to go up to 10 or whatever the magic number is. So I think there is a period, there's going to be a time lag on this, but right now somebody is paying that increased truck move. Somebody is paying for that increased container move. And there's an element of margin that some companies are going to be willing to eat, but a lot of that is going to end up coming back to all of us who are listening to this and participating as consumers. We're going to have to pay the final price on that. Yeah.
I would agree, and I think we haven't necessarily seen all of those price increases come into the market as consumers, but we will see them soon, because what a lot of people don't take into consideration is that contracts were probably signed before the pandemic hit. They were signed under normal shipping conditions with normal shipping costs. We saw last year that contract price basically double year over year, and most pundits were saying that level was going to be the highest we're going to see. We're not going to see it go any higher than that. And fast forward to this year, where it's tripled year over year. So the rate at which large BCOs are signing their contracts is double, if not triple, what it was last year. And so that's really where the inflation is going to start. And the landed cost for these goods is going to increase dramatically. And like Brian said, the end seller, the retailer of this product, is not going to just absorb that cost. It's going to be passed on to the consumer.
And that leads to the next question. I mean, the disruption, has it caused contracts to be negotiated or drafted differently? Or are we acting in 2022 just like we're acting in 2020 or 2019?
Yeah, it's a good question. You want to go first, Brian?
Yeah, I could tell you from the shipper side, it's definitely a different world. If I think back pre-pandemic, and we'll talk, let's say, about ocean for example purposes, you know, there were 1-year contracts. Now we're seeing carriers that want to do 2 years or 3 years on the contract. There's also something called dead freight, which is basically if you don't show up, if your container, if you said you're going to deliver 10 and you only show up with 9, Historically, there were no or very minimal penalties. Now we're seeing these clauses thrown into contracts where you basically have to pay a no-show fee, which again is not something that has historically been there. And what's of more note is it's not reciprocal. If the container shipping line can't provide me the space, I don't get a credit for the container that I couldn't put on. The other element is, you know, there's something called free time, how long you could keep the container, right, to unload it. And historically, carriers have been generous with that. But again, in this contract period, they want to turn their equipment as fast as possible. And so all these types of features have been taken away. And one of the bigger ones that I forgot to mention is, you know, carriers this time around are much preferring port to port rates. They do not want to do historical inland. So if you have a distribution center in Columbus, Ohio, and you wanted a door rate, which means it was all in, right? It was the whole entire cost to move it from Shanghai to Columbus. You know, whatever happened when it got taken off the vessel in LA or how it got to Columbus, that was all included in the rate. Now the carriers don't want to provide that rate because they want to have access to their equipment. And it's a huge challenge for a shipper. If a shipper doesn't have the infrastructure to move their own box in, they're very highly dependent on third parties, and they're treading into unfamiliar territory for some of them on how to get these containers inland and not pay a ton of cost, which detention and demurrage is one of the hottest topics in shipping and for shippers these days. And that's basically the cost to keep a container and not return it back in time. It's way oversimplified version of that, but those are the big differences that we have seen with shippers that were pre-pandemic to what's happening now.
Landon, from your perspective.
Yeah, we see very similar things happening, and it's true. It's very punitive on the shipper. So we have being an NVOCC, which is a non-asset-based transportation company. We see both sides of it. We see what's happening on the carrier side as well as what's happening on our customer side. And I can say that on both sides, there is an interest to change the contracts and to make them more enforceable. The unfortunate reality is that the interests that they both have are completely opposite of each other. And so the customer, the shipper, wants to make these contracts enforceable. Just like Brian said, he wants to have, if I make a deal with you to ship one container every week, I want to be able to get that one container every week. But if I can't get that one container, I want you to be responsible for it. And the carriers are saying, well, we can't be responsible for it. But at the same time, they're saying, if we're going to sign a contract at a certain amount of price for one container every week, you have to show up with that one container every week, or we're going to charge you, like Brian said, some dead freight. We're going to charge you for that container whether you ship or not, which is not something that's unheard of. In many industries, they have that, if you think of the airline industry, but it's something that basically our customers or the shippers are very, very unfamiliar with, and know that there are many things that can happen. I have to go to the airport to catch a plane. I'm pretty much in control of my destiny, barring some freak situations. But in the terms of international shipping, there are many things that can occur. There are many links in the chain that can break down beforehand. And so most shippers are balking at the idea of dead freight because there's so much that's out of their control, whether it be the input of raw materials, whether it be the transportation in China or Vietnam that they can't control, whether it be the congestion at the port in order to get a truck inside to the port to be able to deliver to a vessel. There's so many factors that they're not in control of that it's becoming very interesting to see the push and the pull. Right now, the carriers have that leverage. The ocean carriers are the ones who are able to dictate the terms, but I can see that the shippers are very, very frustrated because it's very difficult for them to manage a lot of these things, and they feel like they're unfairly being punished with some of these contractual obligations, which they would never have agreed to in the first place.
Landon, you touched upon one issue earlier, which is some actions that were taken by some governments. Should there be leading countries or international organization that should do something, that should cause some action to be taken so as to improve the situation?
Yeah, and there are some governing bodies that do focus on transportation, whether it be air freight, ocean freight, or ground freight. I think we've alluded to a couple of the government interventions that we've seen. There are governing bodies that usually enact these things. So, for example, in America, it's the Federal Maritime Committee, which is the FMC, that is in charge of all of the cargo that's being imported over ocean into the United States. They've been taking action. We've also seen other countries trying to protect their own interests, like South Korea has put in some measures to stop the rise in cost. China as well. China has said that all of these dramatic increases in costs are directly affecting their exports or their exporters. And so there are countries who have tried to try and regulate this, or try to at least slow down the rate of increase. But there are some issues, because most of these companies are international companies. They're not usually from the host nation, or at least if they are, there's only one of them, maximum two. So there's a lot of international law that would come into regulating this. And at the end of the day, it is a market of supply and demand.
I don't know, Brian, if there's anything you want to add there.
No, I think, the governing bodies, when I think of like the IMO, right, for the environmental issues, that's been, a very powerful organization there and driving change. Because I think when I look, again, now we're talking about ocean specifically, the carriers have had a hard time, generally speaking, agreeing on standardization of things and terms. So I think it will take more of a committee like that, or a group like that, than the individual governments themselves. Because I think, Landon, you made a very good point, right? Is if there's only one shipping company in your country and it's, almost like a national security piece for you, are you going to really penalize it? Is it in your best interest? And secondly, how are you going to then penalize anyone else that goes in and out of your country potentially without other effects? So I think the best bet is an organization like the IMO and these types of players, where the carriers participate and use them as a way to kind of get consensus.
Now, let me ask you to shine your crystal balls and to answer the following question. Will this issue ever be resolved? And what needs to occur so that we can go back to a situation which is less stressful on the supply chain, on the businesses, on the inflation? How will that get resolved, if at all? So, Ryan.
Yeah, I think it will get resolved. It's just a matter of time, and I think that's the be patient part of the header of the presentation today. It will get resolved. Like we spoke about before, it was such a finely tuned machine, and it just needs, for lack of a better way to describe it, needs to catch up. And I think there's a few ways in which that can happen. Obviously, one is if demand slows down. That's one of, and that would, to be honest, that would have the largest impact the fastest. But that's also something that most people don't want, right, is for demand to slow down. But the other things, right, like if you look right now, the biggest bottleneck when I think about North America is the port throughput. Like they can't unload the vessels right now at the moment. That seems to be the biggest one. That's not a quick fix, right? You need cranes, you need to dredge and build more berths and build infrastructure. So those will take time. And same thing, equipment, right? There was a shortage of chassis, there was a shortage of containers. These things, it's not like you can say, okay, in 30 days, it's all going to be here. So a lot of those types of fixes will take time. But I do think that what inflation will, according to economic theory, right, as inflation goes up, demand should slow down. And if that does occur, then I think the supply chain will catch up. And actually the risk is the opposite. Again, being around for 20 years, I've seen so many cycles in the transportation space of boom and bust. And, there's a perfect storm, Landon. You talked about all the vessels being built. Like if all these vessels come online and all these ports, you know, find solutions and all these chassis appear, and all of a sudden demand drops, you very quickly swing back the other way, and potentially you go back to like the 2018 where you beat up the carrier for the cheapest rate humanly possible, and they're desperate to fill up their vessels again. But the indicators I'd be looking for are again, you know, how long is it taking for my container to get here, period, right, as a total number. And then how does the port look? How quickly is my warehouse able to ingest the product, put it away, and kind of fulfill orders? How quickly am I able to get a truck driver? These types of indicators, if they get back to kind of pre-pandemic, will start to show some normalization, because those are the symptoms you're experiencing right now. If you're a shipper, you're calling and you can't get the trucker wants to charge you $1,000 more. And you know, these are the you know, when you start to see these things alleviate, you're going to see we're going in the right direction.
Yeah. Landon, from your perspective, can we say net 30 days and it will be resolved?
I wish that was the case. I think most people wish that was the case. But I definitely agree with Brian. This will regulate itself, even if it's not the way that we're used to it being. There will be some sort of normalcy in this. We will get to where we need to go so that we don't have these huge levels of disruption. I think there are going to be some changes, and I think Brian very accurately pointed out a lot of the indicators that are necessary to see that. I think we see already some of them coming down. There's been a lot of study been done on this, but we look at the number of ports that are the number of containers that are sitting outside the port of LA and Long Beach. That's gone down to the lowest numbers since September of 2021. We're down to less than 40 by last count. There are alternatively congestion in other areas that we haven't typically seen, because people have diverted away from Los Angeles and Long Beach, but that number is still a good sign that it's coming down. I also read this morning that the number of loads being sought after versus the number of people seeking loads for a full truckload in America has gone down to 4.33. So for every one truck driver, there's 4.33 shipments that are ready to move. That number just 3 months ago was over 7. So those numbers are coming down. We're seeing things dip because of the traditional slowdown that we see in Chinese New Year, as well as some of the lockdowns that are happening in China. But in a historical context, for this to recover, it typically takes, and the last major shock that we had where we were in a situation even nearly comparable to this was the strike on the US West Coast in 2015. The time at which it took to recover to what we considered normal at that time was 8 months. So the expectation is that if we see normal demand going forward, that there's still a process of reorganizing the supply chain, and it would probably take 8 months. So most people, if most industry discussions that I have are looking more towards Q1, potentially after Chinese New Year of next year. At least that's what my crystal ball is telling me.
So that's a long 30 days. Brian, anything to add on this?
No, I mean, if I'm supposed to pick timing on this, I think that the earliest we'll see, I agree with Landon, is after the Chinese New Year period. That's typically the slow season. And so if demand does slow down, I mean, these are orders that are probably being made in the next couple months. You know, people think that you're the t-shirt or the sweater you bought was, just, thought of and made only a month ago. But a lot of this stuff is being ordered now, probably for almost that time period. And so we should have a good inkling. But I do think there'll be a point in 23 where we'll see it. And the other thing that we haven't spoken about is when it happens, I think it will happen quick, the relief. Like the rates, for example, like the ocean spot rates, if the relief comes and the congestion goes away, those rates, it's not like it's going to take 12 months for them to drop. it could literally within weeks, within your 30 days, Denny, you could see significant cost reductions when it happens. So I think that's the other thing to be conscious of. It's not a slow drip. When it happens, it's going to come pretty aggressively.
I think important to note about that, because it's a really good point. But we like to look at statistics in percentages, right? And if we took the percentage, if we had a 10% drop in 2018 in terms of rates, that would represent about $150. A 10% rate today would be a $1,500 decrease, which is going to already be a huge savings for the shippers that are coming in there. So the amount of the drop is also going to be very fast, and it's going to be dramatically beneficial to the shippers.
Well, gentlemen, as a last question from the chat, and we have 2 minutes left. Some businesses arrange for their own transportation. Is it a good solution?
Yeah, it's a very difficult one. Brian, do you want to start?
Sure. I think from my experience, we've seen a lot of retailers try to either charter vessels or come up with creative solutions. We've seen some fail, right? They've chartered a vessel and unfortunately the crew got COVID and there was massive delays and massive unexpected costs. So I think there's also a subset that have historically done this and they've been more successful. So this is one of those, unless you have expertise, you create a lot of risk. You might be successful, everyone can get smart and educated and work with third parties. But from what I've seen, the people who have experience in this have been able to be successful. The people who don't and who have tried to do it, it's more of a crapshoot. It's been more of a 50-50 on success. So just go in with eyes wide open. It's very risky to start your own shipping company, for example, if you're manufacturing shoes.
Yeah, I would tend to agree, and I think leave it to the experts. I would say that it's something that you have to be prepared. The pitfalls are extreme, and there are unexpected costs that you would not understand. But that being said, like Brian correctly said, there are many people who have tried to do it with varying success. I've seen complete disasters where cost estimates were only a third of what actually happened, and also some who have done it pretty well.
Well, gentlemen, we have reached the time that we were allocated. Brian, LANDON, I'd like to thank you tremendously. I hope that those that listened to the presentation appreciated it. I know that from my personal standpoint, I learned a lot. I hope that others can share that. So thanks to the III, and thanks to you both. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.